Welcome, Brain Durham's Nothing But Truth, proudly on AFR Talk. Great to be with you. Our guest is the president of Bowyer Research. He is an economist. He is a Forbes contributor and good friend, Jerry Bowyer. Jerry, welcome.
Thank you, Crane. Good to be with you.
A lot of discussion regarding the remarks of the Pope when it comes to a description, or he was asked about a post in an interview. He was asked about a post in the Economist magazine, which described him as a Leninist for his criticism on capitalism, calling for radical economic reform.
Right.
And this is coming from Catholic Online, by the way, just quoting from their story, and they are quoting what the Pope responded with, quote, "I can only say the communists have stolen our flag. The flag of the poor is Christian. Poverty is at the center of the gospel." The Pope then cited biblical passages about the need to help the poor, the sick, and the needy. And it was something that touched a nerve, certainly with me, and I went to Facebook and went more general with it, not making it about the Pope because I don't want it to be too centered there. I just throwing out the fact of communists being closet Christians.
Right.
And the idea of that. And so tell me this. Is the Pope right? Have the communists stolen the flag of Christianity?
No, they've stolen the flag of Satan, which is to use the poor as a bludgeon to gain power. Marxism is much closer historically to a satanic outlook than it is to a Christian outlook. In fact, there's a great deal of biographical evidence that Marx, as a young man, was influenced by satanic thought. Richard Wurmbrand has written an entire book about this, Marx and Satan. Marx was raised as a Christian, but at some point he turned against the faith and began to write sort of violent, very dark, imagistic poetry, talking about bringing down heaven and crushing humanity and tearing down the world and ascending above the Most High, picking up pieces of language that, we associate from the Scriptures with the satanic worldview. And his father was deeply troubled and actually wrote to him and, talked to him about exorcising the demons that had, worked their ways into his consciousness. So Karl Marx, although raised as a Christian, apostatized very early and violently away from Christianity, and turned in utter hatred against the Christian faith and against God personally. And you see that in his writings, his upholding, Prometheus as the Greek hero. Prometheus is essentially the devil figure of Greek mythology who gave man knowledge, and was punished by the gods for that. So, whether Marx was an outright Satanist or not, there wasn't even an organized satanic church at that time, but he was clearly influenced by satanic themes in the literature of the time. One of his favorite lines was from Goethe's Faust. People know the story. Faust sells his soul to the devil. We're all familiar with that story. One of his favorite lines was from the devil in there, saying everything that is should be destroyed. And Marx quoted that throughout his life, even when he officially became an atheist. It's basically there in a modified form in the Communist Manifesto, which I myself read, when I was a teenager. So Marx is a man who became very hateful against God, against Christians, against humanity, and against existence itself. Who wanted to essentially destroy the world as it was. Now, he needed someone to do that for him. He was not a remarkable man in and of himself. So he couldn't destroy the world on his own. So he needed an army. And that army would be the proletariat, which is not exactly the same as the poor. the urban working class, who he believed capitalism would make poorer and poorer during the Industrial Revolution. And eventually, they would get so sick of their grinding poverty that they would rise up and wipe the property classes and the church off the map. Let's be clear. It was important to Marx that Christianity be destroyed. That was not a side issue for him, that the Christian church be utterly eradicated from planet Earth. So the poor, the proletariat, I should say, would rise up and destroy Christianity, destroy everyone with property, and tear all that down. And that was Marx's great dream, to burn the world using the proletariat. Of course, what went wrong with that is the proletariat never signed on. The working classes never signed on. One of the reasons they didn't sign on is because their living standards were rising under a free market system. And so very early on, Marx and Engels became very frustrated with the quote-unquote the poor or the proletariat because they weren't interested in Marxism. Only the intellectuals were interested in Marxism. It was clear that they didn't want to have a revolution. Why? Because their standards of living were rising, and they understood from some abortive revolutions in the 1840s that revolutions actually make the poor poorer, that they're destructive of wealth. Of course, if you burn your city down, you don't get richer. And so Marx and Engels began to despise the working classes, and they came up with the doctrine of what they called false consciousness, that the poor would be in their benefit to be Marxists, but they're conditioned by, Christianity, the opiate of the masses, religion, to be satisfied with their lot in life, and to be satisfied with a rising standard of living. Things weren't going badly enough for a revolution, and that upset them. They had a saying, the worse, the better. See, if the poor were getting poorer, the Marxists were happier. If they were ground into poverty, Marx liked that because then we might get our revolution and we'll have our army to wipe the property classes and the church off the face of the earth. But instead, the poor were getting richer. So they had to invent this doctrine of false consciousness that the poor don't understand. They don't know that they need this revolution. And so what happened is Marxism made a shift away from a focus on the proletariat towards a focus on the intellectuals. The intellectuals would be the vanguard of the revolution, and they would bring about the revolution. And that's what happened in Russia. It wasn't the working classes who rose up and imposed Bolshevism. The working classes did rise up and try to get rid of the Tsar, and I can understand why. The Tsar was anti-freedom and hurt their standard of living, but they had no interest in a communist revolution. The intellectuals ran the communist revolution, and the first thing they started to do after that was to liquidate the working classes and to liquidate the peasants, the poor, who allegedly Marxism was created to help. It never was about helping the poor. Now, my guess is that Pope Francis has never read Marx or read very little or has not seriously studied the history of this. Otherwise, he would never have made that statement, which is not really defensible, that communism is essentially taking its cues from Christianity in its focus on the poor. It's not. The poor are a bludgeon to kill the rich. You don't love the bludgeon. You just hate the rich. And so the poor were a weapon to destroy the people that Marx and Engels hated.
In the discussion of, obviously, communists or closet Christians is the headline read, and it's going to evoke a response, and the copy editor obviously had a good day with that one. But I think when the Pope or those who are speaking to economics from a Christian perspective, the Christian left in this country, in politics, they've done very well by saying, we are on the side of those in need, and you are on the side of those with greed. And so, Jerry, as we go a little further here, at the heart of it, people are saying Christianity is about morality, and what is the moral thing to do? It's to help those in need. So President Obama can come on and say, hey, this money we're giving to the poor, those in need.
But they're not. Just because you put the money into a portion of the bureaucracy that's named after the poor doesn't mean that you gave the money to the poor. Giving the money to the poor means the poor actually get it, but the poor don't get the money. Bureaucrats get the money. You know, two of the wealthiest zip codes in the United States are the zip code just north of Washington, D.C., and the zip code just south of Washington, D.C. And large proportions of the people working in those zip codes are people who work for anti-poverty agencies. So, like my friend Rob Woodson says, the poor don't get the money. If the poor got the money, poverty would have been eliminated, or at least, poverty being eliminated, you know, it sort of depends what you mean. You actually have to have a change in behavior. But if you just took that money and gave it to the poor, they automatically wouldn't be poor anymore. But most of the money doesn't go to them. Most of the money goes to the people who allegedly are working for the benefit of the poor, but they don't. The money gets siphoned off. So, you know, I would say that as much as they talk about helping the poor, as I look at morality, I think somebody who is indifferent to the poor and is honest about it is morally better than somebody who talks about the poor at the moment that they're eating two-thirds of the poor's bread. If somebody goes around saying the poor, the poor, the poor, the poor, the poor, and takes up the collection, especially by force, and then steals it for himself, to me, that is morally at the bottom of the hierarchy. That was Judas, right? Isn't that what Judas did? Judas was in charge of the poor purse with the 12 apostles, but he stole. So he talked about the poor. He complained, for instance, when a woman used expensive perfume to anoint Jesus' feet. But why, the gospel tells us? Because he was a thief. So he talked about the poor, but he kept the money. So Judas is at the bottom of the moral hierarchy. People who talk about the poor and build up the welfare state and then take the best of it for themselves and keep talking about the poor to get the government to take more from us and take more from the poor. Often these taxes fall on the poor, regressive taxes, for instance. So they talk about the poor, but they actually steal from the poor. They devour widows' houses at the same time they're giving sermons to us about poverty. That is at the bottom of the moral hierarchy, not at the top, even though they pretend to be at the top. So let's be honest about it, and let's not be defensive anymore. People who live at the expense of the poor while wrapping themselves with moral superiority are the Judases of our generation. They are the lowest of the low, and it's about time we start to really talk honestly about who's who instead of being defensive because we don't want a tax rate that's 50%. Because if we say, I think those taxes are too high. Oh, the poor, you're greedy. Really? Who's greedy? You're greedy. The people who take it. You know, I debated Jim Wallace once. He's the leader of the Christian left in America. In 2004, I debated him, and he was so upset because the poverty rate had risen slightly under George W. Bush. The poverty rate is much higher under Obama than it was when I debated Jim Wallace in 2004, and Wallace has not said a thing about it. So do we care about the poverty rate? Do we care about the poor? Or are the poor just something that we wrap ourselves in so we can feel important and go down and shake down donors and taxpayers so we can make ourselves feel good?
Does it also go to who actually should be receiving services and determining that? I remember Michelle Bachmann talked about from Thessalonians, and pardon me, you're the person who can educate us all on these biblical matters in Scripture, but pointing to if you do not work, you will not eat. And in essence, going into Thessalonians, recognizing, okay, yes, we have charity for widows. We have, we help those who are in need. But if you can work.
If you can work, you should work.
Right.
That's what Paul says.
Yeah.
Now, is he inspired? Is he Scripture? Because is he disagreeing with Christ? Did Christ say that people who don't want to work should get paid anyway for not working? He who will not work shall not eat. Let him who steals steal no longer, says Paul, but let him work with his hands. That's the biblical position, because the first commandment that man is given in the history of humanity in Genesis 1 is to fill the earth and subdue it. It's to work. Up until the Great Society, this is what Charles Murray points out in his book Losing Ground, up until the Great Society in America, there had been a bipartisan consensus that poverty relief is conditional upon willingness to work. There were debates about how much should be government versus private. There were debates about how much should be national government versus local government, but there was no debate about whether work would be a requirement. That's gone now. And even in the 1990s, Bill Clinton imposed a work requirement on welfare and his welfare reform. Obama has allowed all of that to expire now. So
Yeah.
we've left a moral consensus that goes back a long time in not paying attention to whether someone's willing to work or not. If the first colony in America, you read this in Plymouth Plantation, the first colony in America, even though it was founded by Christians, they did a communist experiment, and it led to mass starvation. You and I have talked about this in the past. And they decided to go away from that and introduce, we'll talk about it around Thanksgiving, because this is what led to the first Thanksgiving, to assign private property. But the other thing is the governor of Plymouth Plantation put a sign, on the meeting house from Thessalonians, "He who will not work shall not eat." And that doctrine saved the first American colony and set us on a course to freedom, which later, from those small beginnings in one little village, led to America being the greatest economic power in the history of the world.
In understanding where the attacks are coming from, because we've just addressed a few, and really trying to go to the foundation of them, which you have done beautifully, not patronizing, just explaining, and
Thank you.
Accuracy is important. Here's the question. How do you answer the question, well, nobody should have that much, growing inequality, we've got a problem here, and as a Christian, you should be deeply troubled with the fact of someone like a Gordon Gekko who is subverting the system in some way or manipulating the system, and you're okay with that. That person shouldn't make that much money. Nobody should have that much money. You've heard it before. It is the idea to say that you have made money your idol. Money, you're all right with that. We've demonized money, Jerry, both on the right and the left, quite frankly, when it comes to Christians, the body of Christ.
Right.
I'm troubled by that.
I mean, Gordon
deeply.
Gekko is obviously a fictional figure, but I am troubled by the people like that. Ivan Boesky, I think, is who he was based on, because they broke the law. They cheated. I'm troubled by people who gain wealth by cheating. I'm not troubled by people who gain wealth by providing goods and services. I would point this out. You and I have talked about this before, the idea of income inequality. The Bible is very concerned that the poor not fall into degradation. So there's a sort of a bottom limit. If someone is willing to work, if they're able-bodied, or if they're not able-bodied, if they need help, widows and orphans, etc., the Bible is very clear that they cannot be allowed to fall into poverty, into degradation. But the Bible doesn't put a limit at the top. So the Bible never says, don't get too rich. There's only two examples that I know of in the New Testament where there are people who are encouraged to give all their wealth away. And it's fascinating. Only two examples. Maybe someone can come up with a third, but I can't. The Zacchaeus and the rich young ruler. And I would point out, because Jesus had very wealthy friends. Joseph of Arimathea was extremely wealthy. Nicodemus was also wealthy, and they were close friends of Jesus. And Jesus had wealthy people who were early supporters, and so did Paul. He traveled with Lydia, who was very wealthy, selling luxury goods. So she was a wealthy entrepreneur selling to wealthy people. And there was no criticism of all those wealthy people in the Bible. They were generous, of course. Only two people were encouraged to give away their wealth, and both of them were government officials. Isn't that fascinating? Joseph of Arimathea was a merchant. Nicodemus was a merchant. Lydia was a merchant. No criticism, no suggestion that their wealth was illegitimate. But a tax collector and a member of the Sanhedrin, a senator, essentially, who had gotten wealthy, on his government connections. I mean, I think that's implied. We can get into the text more. Was told to sell all he had and give to the poor. And the left likes to talk about Jesus and the rich young man, but let's be clear. It's the rich young ruler. In Greek, he's an archon. And Zacchaeus, the tax collector, are the only people who's ever suggested that their wealth is illegitimate. And I think we need to take that to heart. There's no wasted word in the Bible. The fact that Zacchaeus was a tax collector is not beside the point. The fact that the rich young ruler was a rich young ruler is not beside the point. The gospel tells us that, gives us that specific bit in Luke so that we can understand something. There's no wasted words in the Bible. And it tells us that we go back to what goes back all the way to Deuteronomy. The government was not supposed to be wealthy. In Deuteronomy 17, it says, if you get a king, he should not, what? Multiply wives, he shouldn't multiply horses, and he shouldn't multiply gold. In other words, he shouldn't be sexually degenerate, He shouldn't be that's multiplying wives. He shouldn't be imperial, not an emperor. He shouldn't multiply horses. Horses are for attack, not defense. And he shouldn't multiply gold. In other words, government should not take large portions of the nation's wealth. That's what, and Jesus is just perfectly in that tradition. Solomon started, right? Solomon got 666 talents, a very significant number, of gold. That's picked up later in the book of Revelation. So the Bible is very concerned about wealth in government, with government officials. But it's not. There's never a statement against wealth accumulation by merchants, against them becoming wealthy. There are admonitions for them to be generous, but there's never any criticism for them to generate large amounts of wealth.
And final question, about a minute left, isn't the whole idea here for us to really engage and violate the 10th commandment, to be envious, be covetous of what others have? I mean, isn't that what is at the heart, the fuel, if you will, what galvanizes a movement like this to look at others and try to take? Is that what we are being asked to do as Christians and as Americans?
Yeah, it's covetousness. It's a violation of the 10th commandment to create a political coalition large enough to violate the 8th commandment, which is thou shalt not steal. And it's fascinating to see some Christians get so confused that they see biblical admonitions against government officials not having too much control over wealth, and then they twist that around to support policies which allow government officials to have even more control over wealth. But honestly created wealth, people who go out there in the marketplace and do something well, people who work long hours, people who work hard, people who innovate, people who bring goods and services to large numbers of people, they're not criticized in the New Testament. What's criticized in the New Testament, you see it in the book of James, are people who become wealthy manipulating the courts. Oh, ye rich men, weep and howl, is clearly put in the context of people who manipulate the court system, which we see through trial lawyers and all of the rest of it. So the Bible verses that the left uses, and it's funny, those are the only Bible verses they're interested in, which should clue us into what the real motivation is. The Bible verses that the left uses that condemn politicization, demonization of wealth, and excessive growth of government are used for the very purposes that they're designed to condemn, which is demonization of wealth, politicization of the courts, and the growth of government.
Jerry Bowyer, this is why I started over a decade plus ago, Nothing But Truth, to talk to people like Jerry Bowyer, because he delivers nothing but truth. Jerry, thank you. God
bless. Thank
you,
my friend. God bless you.
Take care. Live with honor in your life, compassion in your heart, and always remember to keep the faith in Jesus Christ. Please check out the guests we've had. I'll be posted on Facebook. And remember that God knows you. God loves you. You're worth it. He created you. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, AFR Talk.